In 1996, when the New York Yankees stood at the pinnacle of world baseball, it was impossible not to mention the name Don Mattingly, the man who had defined an entire era before that with his rare talent and consistency. Throughout the 1980s, he wasn't just an outstanding player. He was the gold standard for a complete first baseman. In 1984, he won the batting championship with a 12.33 average, cementing his status as one of the league's most refined hitters. Just a year later, the 1985 season elevated him to the peak with the American League MVP award, along with 145 RBI leading all of MLB, a number that showed near absolute impact in every game. He was selected to the All-Star team 6 straight times from 1984 to 1989, won 9 Gold Gloves for his exceptional defense, and 3 Silver Sluggers for his consistent offensive output. In 1987, he set a record with 6 Grand Slams in a single season, a feat rare even among the greatest hitters. Beyond individual stats, he became the Yankees' captain from 1991 to 1995, a symbol of quiet leadership who carried an entire franchise through tough times and served as the soul of the team for more than a decade. But behind all those perfect numbers was a different story, one not recorded on stat sheets. When the stadium lights went out, his body began to betray him. Chronic back injury didn't arrive like a storm, but like a small crack spreading day by day, with every swing, every stride carrying pain. He never stopped, never complained, still showed up, still fought, even knowing he was no longer his strongest self. Every passing season wasn't just a battle against opponents, but against his own body, against the fear that he was slowly disappearing. And then the cruelest moment came. He walked away after the 1995 season, in silence, without a championship, without a perfect ending. 1 year later, the Yankees won the World Series. Without him, that wasn't failure. It was a deeper pain, the feeling of standing on the edge of the dream he had spent his entire life chasing. But even in that moment, he didn't resent, didn't turn away, because what made Don Mattingly great wasn't what he achieved, but how he endured, how he kept standing firm, and how he gave everything, even knowing he might receive nothing in return. If this story makes you feel the quiet pain of a legend like Don Mattingly, please hit subscribe so you don't miss the emotional journeys behind the spotlight of sports. But to understand why Don Mattingly became the man he was, someone who always endured in silence, always gave without demanding, always kept going even through pain, we have to go back in time to a place far from the stadium lights, where there were no cheers, no titles, only a boy growing up amid discipline and unspoken expectations in Evansville, Indiana. Don was the youngest in a large family. A home full of love, but never without standards to meet. There, everything was simple. You do well. That's what you're supposed to do. You don't do well enough, you do it again. There were no big praises, no celebratory hugs for every success, because to his father, excellence wasn't special, it was expected. And in that environment, a quiet thought began forming in young Don's mind. My worth isn't in who I am, but in what I do. No one said it directly, but he felt it every day, in every practice, every game, every glance. That boy didn't rebel, didn't resist, didn't try to break free from the mold. Instead, Don did the only thing he knew: try harder. When others rested, he practiced. When others were satisfied, he asked what he still lacked. And gradually, it became instinct. Not trying to outdo others, but trying to deserve to exist. Even when very young, he didn't play baseball just for fun. He played as if every hit was a test, every game a chance to prove he was good enough to stay. But the problem was that feeling of good enough never truly arrived. Every achievement lasted only a brief moment before being replaced by the familiar thought, I can do better. And so the loop began. Try, achieve, then feel it's still not enough. When Don entered high school, his talent became clearer, especially in baseball and basketball. He wasn't just good, he was exceptional. But even as others started seeing it, he didn't feel it the same way. Praise from outside wasn't strong enough to break the belief deeply rooted in him from long before, that he had to keep going, keep advancing, keep proving more. There was never a moment he stopped and said, "I've done enough." Because in the world he grew up in, enough wasn't a destination. It was something that always moved farther away the closer you got. The most heartbreaking thing wasn't that he was forced to be excellent, but that he willingly carried that pressure, turning it into part of who he was. No one demanded he be that perfect, but he set that standard for himself, day after day, year after year. And while everyone around saw a disciplined, hard-working boy who never caused trouble, they didn't realize that behind that silence was a constant battle with himself, a battle he never truly won. It was from those years that something was shaped in him, not just talent, but a way of seeing himself and the world. Don Mattingly didn't grow up to become a star. He grew up to become someone who never allowed himself to stop, and that, in the many years that followed, would become his greatest strength, but also the source of pain he could never escape. Because when you believe you've never been good enough, then no matter how much you achieve, you'll always feel something missing. A void no title can fill and no victory can erase. And then when Don Mattingly stepped into professional baseball, he didn't enter as a phenomenon, not as a name loaded with expectations, not as a prized gem everyone believed would change a team's future. In 1979, when the New York Yankees selected him in the 19th round of the draft, it wasn't a big statement. It was almost a quiet decision, a name buried deep in the list, easily overlooked among hundreds of other young players chasing the same dream. No lights, no attention, no headlines. And for someone used to feeling he had to prove his worth since childhood, that wasn't a shock, it was simply a new chapter of the same story. You're not seen until you force others to see you. The minor league years weren't the fairy tales often told about future stars. No meteoric rises, no instant recognition. There were long days, tiring bus rides, small fields with no crowds, and games where it seemed no one cared about the outcome. There, Don wasn't the center of anything. He was just another player trying to survive in a system that could eliminate you any day without reason. And in that environment, a familiar feeling began returning. The feeling he had carried from childhood, that he could disappear at any moment. But instead of resisting, instead of demanding recognition, he chose the only way he knew: work. Not flashy work, but quiet, almost invisible persistence. He practiced when no one watched, refined every swing, every step, every small detail that could make a difference. While other prospects got attention, were talked about as the team's big future, Don stayed there in silence, improving himself day by day without needing witnesses. And perhaps because no one expected it, he didn't allow himself to fail. Outside evaluations weren't always fair. He wasn't the most physically imposing player, not the one with explosive power, and certainly not the name that made others stop and say, "This will be a superstar." To many, he was just a solid player, someone who could do his job well, but not the one who changed the game. And those evaluations, even if unspoken, lingered like a shadow behind every time he stepped on the field. A reminder that he was never truly seen as special. But the most heartbreaking part was that he never reacted to it. No anger, no declarations, no effort to prove to the world they were wrong. He just kept going, day after day, carrying a quiet belief that if he did enough, if he tried enough, one day it would speak for itself. And in that process, he seemed to accept a hard truth, that he might never be seen the way others were seen. That feeling, the feeling of always being on the edge of everything, that one slip and he'd vanish, never left him. It wasn't explosive fear, but a quiet current seeping into every thought, every action. Every time he stepped on the field, it wasn't to shine, but to survive. Every time he held the bat, it wasn't to become a hero, but to make sure tomorrow he was still there. And it was in that silence, in that unseen persistence, that Don Mattingly gradually built the foundation for the man the world would later praise. But at that time he was still just the boy no one saw, a person fighting the fear of disappearing while no one around truly noticed. And then the boy no one truly saw one day stepped into the center of the baseball world. When Don Mattingly first put on the pinstripes of the New York Yankees, it should have been the moment a dream became reality, but instead it felt like walking into a room where every eye was waiting for you to make a mistake. New York wasn't like anywhere else, and the Yankees weren't like any other team there. History didn't just exist. It weighed on your shoulders, every title, every legend, every expectation whispering that you had to be worthy of everything that came before. But Don didn't step in as someone welcomed. He stepped in as someone who had to prove he deserved to stay. And in those first games, nothing truly stood out. No performance that made people stop and recognize him right away. Just ordinary hits, quiet days on the field, and a growing feeling that this chance was more fragile than he thought. In New York, you don't get time to develop slowly. You either shine or get replaced. The media isn't patient, the fans don't wait, and the team always has someone else ready to take your spot. And for someone who grew up with the fear that he could disappear at any moment, that environment wasn't just pressure, it was confirmation of his deepest fear. Every game stopped being a chance to show what he could do and became a test of survival, where every missed hit, every small mistake could be the reason you're out of the lineup the next day. No one said it outright, but Don felt it in every moment. He stood in the batter's box, in every glance toward the dugout, wondering if this would be the last time he stood there. What makes the story even more heartbreaking is how he responded to all of it. He didn't try to become a star overnight, didn't seek attention, didn't play baseball to be loved. He played to not get cut. Every swing wasn't to make a mark, but to survive one more day. Every game wasn't a chance to shine, but a fight to prove he couldn't be replaced yet. And in that process, he withdrew more, grew quieter, pushed himself into a state where mistakes weren't allowed to exist. Some players enter MLB with the confidence that they belong there. Don Mattingly didn't. He entered with the feeling that he was borrowing a spot, that at any moment this door could close, and he'd be the invisible boy no one remembered again. And that's why he never let himself enjoy the moment. Never let himself breathe easy. Never let himself think he'd made it. Because in his world, made it didn't exist. There was only keep going, and keep going, until there was nothing left to lose. That tension wasn't always visible from the outside. To fans, he was just a young player trying to find his footing. But inside, it was a constant battle, relentless pressure, a fear that everything could end before it really began. And perhaps it was in those months that something solidified in him, not just skill, but a way of existing. Play not to win, but to not disappear. And that very thing, in the years that followed, would make him one of the most consistent players the Yankees ever had. But it was also what kept him from ever truly feeling safe, even when the whole world started calling his name. And then what he had quietly pursued through all those years no one saw, finally happened. Don Mattingly was no longer the overlooked name. He started hitting with near-perfect precision, swings no longer hesitant but decisive, smooth and effective. And game after game, people began to realize something special was forming. In 1984, he won the batting championship with a 24-3 average, a number that spoke not just to technique, but to astonishing consistency in an environment where pressure could destroy anyone. And then, in 1985, he didn't just play well, he dominated. 145 RBI, leading the entire league. Every hit, not just scoring runs, but bringing hope to a team searching for direction. the American League MVP award came as undeniable recognition. The once invisible boy had become one of the best players in the world. In the years that followed, he didn't fade, he sustained. Consecutive All-Stars, Gold Gloves, Silver Sluggers, numbers, titles, praise began piling up. Fans no longer asked, "Who is he?" They started assuming that whenever the New York Yankees needed a big hit, that name would be Mattingly. The media began calling him the soul of the team, a new icon for the Yankees after their earlier glorious years. He was no longer the one trying to survive, he was the standard, the one other players were compared to. The one where, when he stepped into the batter's box, the whole stadium held its breath. But the strangest thing was, inside him, nothing changed. No sense of safety, no moment where he could exhale and say, "I've done it." The titles didn't erase the fear. They only made it bigger. Because when you have nothing, you only fear failure. But when you have everything, you start fearing losing it all. And for Don Mattingly, that fear wasn't distant. It was always there, quiet, patient, waiting. Every season wasn't a chance to enjoy success, but a new challenge to protect it. Every missed hit wasn't just a small error, but a reminder that everything could start crumbling right here. He didn't look at the stat sheet to see he was leading. He looked at every game and wondered, can this disappear? And in his world, the answer was always yes. That kept him from ever truly living in the moment. When fans celebrated, he thought about the next game. When the media praised, he thought about the imperfect swing. When others saw a star at his peak, he only saw a version of himself he had to maintain, day by day, little by little, as if it could shatter if he let go even for a second. Success for him wasn't a destination. It was a fragile state that always needed guarding, always at risk of vanishing. And perhaps the most heartbreaking thing is that no one really noticed it. To the outside world, Don Mattingly was the image of certainty, of reliability, of a player you could trust completely. But inside, he lived in the complete opposite state. Uncertain, unsafe, always preparing for the possibility that tomorrow everything he built might be gone. And that turned every success into a burden, every title into a reminder that he had to keep going, had to be better, had to not allow mistakes. For many, 1985 was the peak. But for Don Mattingly, it wasn't the peak, it was the start of new pressure, new fear, new battle. Because from that point on, he was no longer fighting to be seen. He was fighting to not lose what he had finally gained. And in a world like New York, where everything can change after just one season, that fear wasn't irrational. It was reality. A reality he carried every day, every game, every swing, like a reminder that even at the top, the door behind you can always close, at any time. And then when Don Mattingly reached his personal peak, when his name wasn't just spoken in New York but across America, something almost inevitable happened. He was no longer just an excellent player. He became the face of an entire team, a living symbol of the New York Yankees in a time when they desperately craved to reclaim their lost glory. Consecutive All-Star nods, Gold Gloves reflecting near-perfect defense, precise and steady hits turned him into the standard of excellence. All of it placed him in a position not everyone is ready to carry, the position of the one on whom all hope is placed. When the Yankees needed someone to represent them, they looked to Mattingly. When the team needed a decisive hit, they waited for him. And gradually, without anyone saying it outright, something formed. If the Yankees won, it was the team. But if they failed, the eyes turned to him. Those years weren't easy for the Yankees. The team still had shining moments, still had games that gave fans hope, but they could never reach the end, could never touch the World Series championship the whole city was waiting for. And with every passing season, the gap between almost enough and enough seemed to grow wider. But the most heartbreaking thing wasn't that the team didn't win it, was how Don Mattingly carried it, like a personal responsibility. No one officially blamed him. No headline said he had failed. But in his inner world, everything pointed to one thing. If the team wasn't good enough, perhaps it was because he wasn't good enough. That was a way of thinking only people like him carried. People who don't look for outside excuses, don't blame circumstances, but turn inward and ask what more they could do. And so every time a season ended without a title, he didn't just feel disappointment. He felt guilt. His numbers were still impressive, his performances still steady. But in his mind, all of it became meaningless if it didn't lead to the most important thing. He didn't look at the MVP award or All-Star appearances to see his value. He looked at the team's record and saw a void he believed he was supposed to help fill. That made the burden he carried not just the burden of a player, but of an entire franchise. The Yankees weren't just a team, they were a symbol of victory, an organization whose history was built on championships. And when those championships didn't come, the pressure didn't just sit with management or the collective, it fell on the clearest representative. And in that time, no one represented the Yankees more clearly than Don Mattingly. He wasn't the loudest, wasn't the one who spoke most, but his silence and steadiness made him the center of every expectation. There were nights after games ended, when the stadium was empty, when the lights dimmed, when he didn't think about his successful hits, didn't think about the praise he'd get the next day. He thought about moments he could have done better, swings that missed by just a fraction, opportunities he felt he hadn't seized, and in those thoughts a belief sank deeper, that everything he had achieved still wasn't enough, because the one thing he truly wanted, the thing he believed would confirm it all, still hadn't come. That was the paradox of greatness in Don Mattingly's story. He reached a height very few could touch, but that very height highlighted what he didn't have. Other players might be remembered for one outstanding season, for one personal title, but for him, everything always seemed defined by what was missing. And the greater he became, the clearer that void grew. It didn't disappear, didn't shrink, it expanded, like a shadow following him through every season, every game. And perhaps that was when a seed began to form, a thought he couldn't yet name, but started to feel, that maybe, just maybe, his greatness would never come with what he craved most, that he could do everything right, could become one of the best players of his era, but still lack a crucial piece. He couldn't control himself. And if that was true, then all the effort, all the sacrifice, all the years he had given would forever carry an unanswered question. Why still not enough? And then, when Don Mattingly had become the icon of the New York Yankees, when his name echoed in every stadium and was spoken with respect across America, a quiet paradox began to take shape. He was known by millions, yet truly understood by almost no one. Fans loved him not just for his talent, but for the way he played. Calm, disciplined, unflashy, always putting the team above himself. The media praised him as the ideal model of a professional athlete. No scandals, no drama, no controversy. In an era when many stars chased the spotlight and attention, Don Mattingly seemed to go the opposite way. He didn't try to become famous. He simply did his job well, day after day. But that very silence, that very reserve, created a distance not everyone noticed. People saw the numbers, the titles, the moments on the field, but they didn't see what happened when the game ended, when he left the stadium, when there were no more cheers or lights shining on him. Don wasn't the type to step in front of cameras to share his feelings, wasn't the one to talk about his struggles or the pressure he carried. He kept it all inside, just as he had since he was a boy in Indiana. And gradually that created a life where the real him became separate from the image the world saw. To the public, he was a hero, a player you could trust, a symbol of stability on a constantly changing team. But in his private world, he was still the one who always felt he wasn't good enough, still the one carrying the pressure to prove himself, still the one who didn't allow himself rest, No one really saw those thoughts because he never spoke them. And perhaps that's why no one truly understood him. The loneliness he experienced wasn't the loneliness of being abandoned. It was the loneliness of someone always standing in the middle of a crowd, but unable to share what he was truly feeling. He was surrounded by teammates, by fans, by media, but few ever stepped close enough to see the pressure he carried every day. No one saw the nights he thought about small mistakes, moments he felt he hadn't done enough, worries he couldn't name but were always there. In the world of baseball, where success often comes with confidence and showmanship, Don Mattingly was an exception. He didn't use fame to build a bigger persona, didn't leverage the spotlight to become a public figure the way many others did. He kept everything simple, kept everything real. And perhaps that very thing made him harder to reach. People could admire him, could love him, but to truly understand him, that was another story. And in that gap, between the public image and the real person, a quiet tension existed. Every time he stepped onto the field, he didn't just carry the team's expectations. He carried the image everyone had assigned him, the image of someone always steady, always in control, always reliable. But inside he was still fighting himself, still afraid he might not live up to those expectations. And because he never shared that with anyone, it became a burden he carried alone. Perhaps the most heartbreaking thing is that even when he achieved everything a player could dream of, recognition, respect, the love of fans, he still didn't find the feeling of being understood, and that turned his fame into a double-edged sword. It gave him the position he had worked his whole life to reach, but it also created a distance he couldn't cross. He became someone everyone knew, but no one could really touch, and in that silence, in that unnoisy loneliness, Don Mattingly kept doing what he always did, kept playing, kept giving, kept carrying the unseen pressure. But the farther he went, the wider the gap grew between the person the world saw and the person he felt inside. And perhaps that was one of the deepest tragedies of this story, that you could be loved by millions and still feel completely alone. And then, amid all the expectations, the praise and the titles, something began to change. Not loudly, not suddenly, but quietly and persistently, like a small crack appearing where no one could see it. For Don Mattingly, it started as an uncomfortable feeling in his back, a fleeting pain he initially thought was just the result of constant play, of thousands of repeated swings, of a body that had worked too much in silence. But the pain didn't go away. It returned, this time clearer, deeper, like a reminder that something was wrong inside his body. Herniated disc, a diagnosis that carried none of the drama of major injuries. No dramatic collapse on the field or gasping in pain for the crowd to witness. But precisely because of that, it was more dangerous. It didn't arrive to end everything in one moment. It arrived to wear him down gradually, day by day, game by game, in every smallest movement. And the scariest part was that it didn't disappear when the game ended. It was there when he sat in the dugout, when he stood up, when he tried to sleep at night. It became part of life, a part he couldn't separate from. But just like the way he had lived his whole life, don't stop. He didn't step in front of the media to talk about the pain, didn't seek sympathy, didn't allow himself to think this might be something bigger. Instead, he did the only thing he always did. Kept going. He stepped onto the field, gripped the bat, and played as if nothing had changed, as if his body was still the one that had taken him to the top. But the truth was that every swing now came with a cost. Every time he swung wasn't just an effort to hit the ball, it was a challenge to a body that was slowly betraying him. Some days the pain was just a whisper, small enough for him to ignore. But other days it became a scream, spreading through his back, pulling at every movement, turning things that were once instinct into something difficult. And in those moments, he still didn't stop, not because he didn't realize what was happening, but because he didn't know what else to do. Baseball wasn't just his career, it was how he defined himself, how he proved he was good enough, how he existed. And so stopping wasn't just resting, It was like losing himself. But the body doesn't care about those things. It doesn't care about titles, expectations, history, or the love of fans. It simply reacts to what it's enduring, and gradually, little by little, it began taking away what he had built. The power in his hits wasn't the same. Flexibility decreased. Movements that were once natural now required more effort. And the most heartbreaking thing wasn't that the change happened, it was how it happened slowly. Enough for him to notice every part of himself fading, but not fast enough for him to accept it and move on. Baseball, the thing he loved, the thing that gave him everything, now also became the source of his pain. Not because he no longer loved it, but because every time he played, he paid for it with his own body. And in a cruel paradox, the thing that had defined him was now slowly destroying him. But even realizing that he still didn't turn away, because in Don Mattingly's world, you don't quit when things get hard. You just keep going, no matter the cost. And perhaps deep in his mind a thought began to appear. Not clear yet, not fully formed, but enough to make him uneasy. That maybe, just maybe, this story wouldn't end the way he had imagined. That not every journey leads to a perfect conclusion. That there are paths where even if you take every step right, you still end up somewhere you never wanted to be. And as that thought grew, it didn't just bring fear, it brought a quiet sense of loss. The feeling that something was slipping from his grasp, slowly but unstoppable, like the door he had once feared would close, now gradually shutting, and there was nothing he could do to keep it open. And then what Don Mattingly had quietly feared for a long time finally became reality, not in a dramatic moment, not in a fateful game, but in a slow, almost cruel process, when he began to realize he was no longer himself, no longer the hitter who made the whole stadium hold its breath every time he stepped into the batter's box. No longer Donnie Baseball that every pitcher had to respect. Hits weren't as sharp as before. Reaction times slowed by just a beat. Power no longer exploded like in his peak years. And the most heartbreaking thing was that he didn't need anyone to tell him. He felt it himself, in every imperfect swing, in every ball that dropped instead of soaring like it used to. At first, he tried to ignore it, just like he had ignored the pain. He told himself it was just a phase, that he'd adjust, find the feeling again, come back. But the harder he tried, the clearer the gap became between the current him and the past him. And that was a different kind of pain. Not physical pain, but the pain of facing your best self and realizing you can no longer reach it. Every time he looked at the stat sheet, it wasn't pride like before. It became a reminder. Not comparing to others, but to himself, to the seasons he once dominated, to the numbers he once saw as the standard. And in that comparison, he didn't see progress. He saw loss. A part of himself was slowly vanishing, not suddenly, but little by little. Enough for him to notice, enough for him to hurt, but not enough for him to stop. That created a crisis not everyone saw. Because to the outside world he was still Don Mattingly, still the familiar name, still the player fans remembered with respect. But inside he was starting to lose what had defined him his whole life. Baseball wasn't just work, it was identity. It was the answer to "Who am I?" And when he could no longer play like before, that question became more terrifying than ever. If I'm no longer Donnie Baseball, then who am I? That wasn't a question he spoke out loud, but it was present in every thought, every silent moment. Because when you spend your whole life becoming something you don't prepare for, the day you're no longer that thing. And for Don, that day didn't come like a slamming door. It came like a door slowly closing, a little more each day, a little more each game, until he realized he was standing on the other side with no preparation. The greatest tragedy wasn't the decline. In sports, that's inevitable. The tragedy was that he had to witness it happening, fully awake, fully aware of every small change, every part of himself slipping away. No denial, no illusion, just the truth, clear and unavoidable. He knew he wasn't the same anymore, and that turned every game into a different experience. No longer the place he expressed himself, but the place he confronted what he had lost. And in that process, an old fear returned, the fear that had followed him from the beginning, that he could disappear. But this time it wasn't a distant possibility. It was happening right in front of him, not disappearing from the lineup immediately, not being replaced overnight, but a slow vanishing where the version of him the world once knew was gradually fading, step by step. But even as it happened, he still didn't stop. Not because he believed he could return to the top, but because he didn't know what else to do. He still stepped onto the field, still gripped the bat, still tried, as if just continuing would make everything okay. But deep down he knew some things, once lost, never come back, and that realization didn't bring relief. It brought a quiet sadness, an emptiness no one around could see. Don Mattingly wasn't just losing form, he was losing himself. And the most painful thing wasn't that it was happening, but that he had to stand there watching every part of himself disappear, without being able to do anything to hold it back. And then, when everything began to crack, when his body was no longer what it used to be and his form slowly slipped away, Don Mattingly stood before a choice that not everyone recognized, a path that could have changed his entire story. In another world, in another version of his life, he could have left the New York Yankees, gone to a team closer to a championship, where the final years of his career might have ended with a title he had chased his whole life. Many players had done it. Many had chosen to leave for a better shot, to put themselves in a position to touch the World Series. And if Don Mattingly had done that, no one could have blamed him, but he didn't do it. Instead, he stayed, not because he didn't know about the opportunities out there, not because he didn't understand that his time was running out, but because to him the Yankees weren't just a team. It was where he had grown up, where he had fought to be seen, where he had become the person the world knew. And leaving, for him, wasn't just changing uniforms, it was like abandoning a part of himself. So he stayed. And over time, that loyalty wasn't just a choice, it became his identity. He was given the captain's armband from 1991, becoming the leader of a new generation, young players stepping into a team whose history was both pride and pressure. In the clubhouse, he wasn't the one who talked the most, wasn't the one giving big speeches, but he was the one everyone looked to when things got tough. He led by action, by consistency, by the way he kept showing up every day, no matter what his body was enduring. But that very loyalty, over time, began to carry a price. Because when you choose to stay, you also choose to carry everything that comes with it. The failures, the incomplete seasons, the missed chances. And in Don Mattingly's case, every season that passed without a title wasn't just a team failure. It was a reminder that he had chosen this path. There were nights when he looked at other teams going farther, when he saw other players lifting the trophy he craved. A question probably flickered in his mind. What if I had chosen differently? What if I had left? What if I had put myself in a different situation? Would everything have been different? But those weren't questions he let linger too long, because once he chose, he didn't look back. He kept moving forward, even as the road grew harder. And in that choice, a quiet tragedy took shape. Because morally, humanly, he had done the right thing. He was loyal, he was steadfast, he didn't chase easier paths, but in sports, right doesn't always lead to rewarded. There are noble choices, but their price can be too high. Don Mattingly became the heart of the Yankees in the years when they couldn't win. He guided young players, passed on to them the values he had lived by: discipline, dedication, quiet, relentless work. And ironically, those very players, that very generation he helped shape, would later step into a new era, an era of championships he could never reach. His loyalty was never questioned, but over time it stopped being just an admirable quality. It became a burden he carried every day. not because he regretted it, but because he understood he had put everything into one place, and that place still couldn't give him what he craved most. And perhaps that was one of the most painful paradoxes in his story, that sometimes you can do everything right, live by the highest values, stay loyal to the end, and still not receive what you sacrificed your whole life to chase. Don Mattingly didn't choose the easier path. He chose the path he believed was right. But that very path, over time, became a journey whose ending never came the way he hoped to journey, where every step carried an unspoken question: if everything was done right, why still not enough? And then, after all those years of silent endurance, after all the times he tried to push through the pain no one really saw, Don Mattingly entered the 1995 season, not as a new chapter full of hope, but as an ending he himself could feel drawing near. His body was no longer something he could trust. The back pain was no longer a minor obstacle he could overcome with willpower. It had become an inseparable part, present in every movement, every stride, every swing. Some days just standing up was a challenge, but he still took the field, not because he thought he was still at his peak, but because he had never known how to stop. That season wasn't a story of comeback. It was a story of endurance. Every game was a trade-off between continuing and protecting himself. But Don didn't choose protection. He chose continuation. No big statements, no dramatic moments for the media to exploit. Just a man, day after day, putting on the New York Yankees uniform and stepping onto the field, knowing he was no longer the version the world once knew, but still refusing to walk away. He knew very clearly that he wasn't the same anymore. He didn't need anyone to tell him, didn't need stats or commentary. He felt it in every hit that lacked power, in every reaction slowed by a beat, in moments he once handled easily, but now found difficult. And the most heartbreaking thing was that he didn't try to deny it. He accepted it, but he didn't accept stopping. There were moments that season when he stood on the field and looked around, perhaps realizing he was living his final days in the uniform he had worn his whole career. No official farewell, no big announcement, but deep down something was clear. This might be the last time. And in those moments the silence grew heavier than ever. Not the silence of the stadium, but the silence inside him, where every emotion, every thought seemed impossible to put into words. The peak of that season came in the playoffs, a rare chance he had waited his entire career for. When the Yankees reached the postseason, it wasn't just a team achievement. It was a glimmer of hope for Don Mattingly. And in the series against the Seattle Mariners, he had moments people would remember forever, especially the home run in Game 2. A hit that didn't just score runs, but carried everything he had endured, everything he had waited for. In that moment, he wasn't the man slowly losing himself. He was Donnie Baseball again. But the story didn't end like a dream. The Yankees lost in Game 5. The season ended, and with it a journey closed, not with a title, not with a perfect ending, but with a silence. Only those who lived it truly understood. No coronation, no trophy lift, no final affirmation that everything he had done led to what he craved most. Just acceptance. Acceptance that his body could go no farther. Acceptance that the time had come, whether he was ready or not. And perhaps deep down acceptance that some things in life, no matter how hard you try, won't come the way you expect. When the 1995 season ended, Don Mattingly didn't make any grand declaration. He didn't seek attention, didn't turn the moment into an event. He left the way he had lived, quietly, but that very quietness made his story more heartbreaking, because nothing hid the reality that one of the greatest players of his generation had ended his career without what he desired most. And when he walked off the field for the last time in Yankees colors, there was no soundtrack, no scripted goodbye, Just a man walking away, carrying everything he had given and everything he never got back. And then, after the 1995 season closed in silence, after all the pain Don Mattingly had carried through the final years of his career, something he had tried to avoid could no longer be delayed. He retired. No loud press conference, no grand statements, just a quiet decision, like the way he had lived his entire career. And when that decision was made, a part of him stopped to the part, tied to baseball, to stadiums, to the sound of ball on bat, to everything that had defined him his whole life. For the first time in many years, he didn't have to wake up and prepare for a game. No more enduring pain to take the field. No more proving anything to anyone. And it should have been a release, but instead, it felt like a void. A silence so vast he didn't know what to do with it. Life slowed down. No more schedule, no more daily pressure, no more daily pressure, no more cheers. Just a man and his own thoughts. And in that stillness, the questions he hadn't had time to face before began to appear clearer than ever. If I'm no longer Donnie Baseball, then who am I? When there's no field to step onto, no team to give to, no clear goal to chase, what is left? He wasn't someone who sought attention, wasn't someone who needed lights to feel he existed, but when the lights went out completely, he realized he had spent his whole life living in a world with clear structure, where every day had a purpose, every game had meaning, and now all of that was gone. Then a year passed. 1996. The New York Yankees won the World Series. They raised the trophy he had chased his entire career. Without him, no further explanation needed, no analysis required. Just that fact existing enough to shatter everything he had held inside. Not jealousy, not resentment. Don Mattingly wasn't that kind of person, but some pains don't need to be named to exist. And this was one of them. Because he knew he had been there through the hardest years. He knew he had carried the team on his shoulders when they weren't ready to win. He knew he had stayed, been loyal, led, given everything. And then, right after he left, everything he had waited for his whole life arrived. That irony didn't need to be spoken. It was present in every moment he saw his old team celebrate, in every image of the trophy being lifted, in every cheer he had once dreamed of being part of. And amid all of it, one unspoken line rang out clearer than any words. The next year, they won. Without him. That wasn't just a fact. It was a cut. A deep cut, quiet, bloodless, but enough to leave a mark forever. Because it didn't just speak about one season. It spoke about his entire journey, about the years he had given, about what he had sacrificed, about all the times he stood so close but never touched it. And in that moment, something inside him probably changed. Not pride, not love for the Yankees. Those remained. But perhaps for the first time, he truly felt the weight of everything he had lost, not because he had done anything wrong, not because he had chosen the wrong path, but because sometimes life doesn't work the way we believe it should. Don Mattingly had done everything right, and precisely because of that, what happened next was even more painful. And then, after that moment, after that undeniable truth quietly etched itself into his mind, Don Mattingly didn't react the way many might imagine. He didn't speak out, didn't show bitterness, didn't seek attention to tell what he had been through. He just watched. From afar, watched the New York Yankees step into a new era, an era of victories, of titles, of moments he had once believed he would be part of. But now he was no longer there, no longer in the dugout, no longer on the field, no longer the person the cameras sought when the team achieved something big. Celebrations took place, historic photos were taken, new names became icons of a different time, and in all those moments, there was a void. Not everyone noticed. The void of someone who had once been the center of it all but now no longer appeared in the story, not because he was erased, not because he was forgotten. People still remembered him, still respected him, still spoke of him as a legend. But memory and the present are two different things, and in that present he no longer stood in the place he once belonged. What's most worth noting is that he wasn't jealous. Don Mattingly wasn't the type to look at others' success and feel something had been taken from him. He understood the team had to move forward, that the young players he had once guided deserved what they achieved. He didn't resent them, didn't resent the organization, didn't resent fate, but not being jealous didn't mean it didn't hurt. Some feelings don't need a negative name to exist, and for him, it was an emptiness. A deep silence nothing could fill. He saw what happened, and he understood better than anyone the path that led there. He knew how the foundations had been built, knew how the hard years had shaped the team, and precisely because of that, standing outside it all wasn't a complete detachment. It was a painful closeness. He wasn't a stranger to that story. He was part of it. But he was also no longer the one written into the final pages. That was a kind of tragedy only those who have gone far enough can understand, the tragedy of growth, of accepting that not every story you start will end with you there. There are journeys where you play a crucial role in the beginning, but aren't the one who sees the end. And accepting that isn't easy. It doesn't come in one moment. It comes slowly, over time. Through every time he watched his old team keep moving forward without him. He wasn't abandoned, but he no longer belonged to that story. That line wasn't an accusation. It was a truth. A truth Don Mattingly had to learn to live with, because in his world he had always believed that if he did enough, if he gave enough, if he stayed loyal enough, then one day everything would end the way he wanted. But life doesn't operate by those rules. It isn't always fair, isn't always logical, and doesn't always give you the ending you deserve. And so he learned to accept, not by forgetting, not by denying what happened, but by carrying it as part of himself. He no longer stood on the field, but what he had done was still there, in every layer of Yankees history, in every value the team continued to carry. But at the same time, he also had to face another truth, that there are moments, the biggest moments, he would forever only be an observer. And perhaps that was the hardest part. Not that he had no title, not that he wasn't recognized, but that he had to live with the feeling that he had been so close, yet never truly touched it, that the story he had spent his whole life writing had an ending where he didn't appear. Don Mattingly wasn't forgotten. But in the final chapter of the story he helped build, he was no longer the main character. And sometimes that is a pain deeper than any failure. The pain of knowing you once belonged there. But now you're only a memory. And then, after everything that was lost, after accepting that some chapters in life will never have a perfect ending, Don Mattingly began a new journey, not as a star on the field, but as a man learning to live without the lights. There was no clear turning point, no day he woke up and felt he was okay. The process came slowly, just like everything that had left him before, little by little, quietly, unseen by anyone. He returned to baseball, but not as the one holding the bat. He stood in a different place in the dugout, behind young players who were starting the journey he had once taken. With the New York Yankees, then later the Los Angeles Dodgers and Miami Marlins, he became a coach, a manager, a guide. But even in that role he didn't change who he was. He didn't become loud, didn't turn himself into the center of attention. He did what he always did: observe, guide, and give in silence. To the young players, he didn't just pass on technique. He passed on a way of seeing the game, discipline, the value of showing up every day and doing the right thing even when no one is watching. Perhaps in those moments, he saw a part of himself again, the boy from years ago who tried relentlessly to prove his worth. But this time, he didn't demand they be perfect, the way he once demanded of himself. He didn't say it, but the way he led showed one thing. He understood the cost of the obsession with perfection, and he didn't want others to carry it the way he had. Alongside baseball, another part of his life gradually became clear, the part that had always stood behind the lights. Family. He no longer had to travel constantly, no longer lived by a packed game schedule. He had time to be a husband, a father, not in fleeting moments between seasons, but in ordinary days, moments he had missed before. And perhaps right there he began to find something he had never truly had: a sense of existence. Not dependent on achievements, not defined by numbers or titles. But that journey wasn't healing in the way stories usually tell it. No blinding moment, no sudden change. Don Mattingly wasn't the type to stand up and say he had overcome it all. He didn't do that. His healing, if it could be called that, came from small things, from accepting he was no longer the old person, and that didn't mean he had lost value. He was no longer Donnie Baseball, no longer the name that made entire stadiums hold their breath, no longer the icon millions followed, but in that loss something new appeared. A normal person, no need to prove anything, no need to chase a standard he could never reach. And perhaps for the first time in his life he began to understand that his worth wasn't in what he achieved, but in who he was. That wasn't an easy journey. The memories were still there, the questions still existed. The moments he didn't have still couldn't be changed, but instead of letting them define him, he learned to carry them as part of his story, not the whole story. And in his familiar silence, Don Mattingly continued to live, not as a legend chasing lost glory, but as a man learning to exist without it. Not loud, not perfect, but real. And then, when looking back at Don Mattingly's entire journey, people don't see a story written in complete victories, but a life shaped by discipline, endurance, and rare loyalty. From the boy in Indiana who grew up under strict standards, always feeling he wasn't good enough, to the man who wore the New York Yankees uniform and became an icon for an entire generation that wasn't. The journey of someone handed everything, but of someone who built himself little by little in silence. He wasn't the one who won the most. He wasn't the one with the most titles, and certainly not the one with the perfect ending. Sports often promises in the most beautiful stories. There was no World Series ring to close his career. No trophy-lifting moment to confirm everything he did was worth it. If you look only at the final numbers, people might say he lacked something. But if you look deeper, you'll see there are values that can't be measured by titles. Because if there was one thing Don Mattingly did, it was give everything. He held nothing back. He didn't choose easier paths. He didn't leave when things got hard. He stayed. He endured. He continued even when his body betrayed him, even when time wasn't on his side, even when the reward he craved most seemed farther away every day. And that is what defined him, not as a winner in the traditional sense, but as a man with values not everyone can hold firm. Loyalty, character, integrity, vintegrity. Those weren't grand words he spoke, they were things he lived every day. In a world where many are willing to change for success, he stayed the same. In an environment where pressure can break people, he stood firm. And even when his story didn't end the way he wanted, he still didn't change how he saw life, didn't let that absence turn him into someone else. Some legends are remembered for winning moments. Don Mattingly is remembered for how he lived between those moments, for how he faced pain without resentment, for how he kept going without needing recognition, and for how he accepted that some things in life can't be controlled, but that doesn't diminish the value of what he did. His story isn't about someone who got everything. It's about someone who gave everything and kept living even when the most important thing he chased never arrived. And in that, there is a different kind of greatness, a greatness that doesn't need titles to be confirmed. Because in the end, Don Mattingly didn't fail. He simply stood very close to his dream and watched it move on without him. He didn't fail the game simply moved on without him. The story of Don Mattingly doesn't just inspire admiration, it leaves a very deep sadness, because he did everything right, yet still didn't get what all of America believed he deserved. From a childhood of harsh discipline in Indiana, where he formed the belief that his worth had to be proven through achievements, to the quiet years in the minor leagues with the feeling that he could disappear at any moment, then rising to become the 1985 MVP and the icon of the New York Yankees, all of it showed a man who never surrendered. But the very perfection he pursued became a burden. He blamed himself when the team didn't win championships, kept playing through a herniated disc, and watched himself decline day by day without being able to stop. The peak tragedy came in 1996 when the Yankees won the World Series right after he retired, a detail that needs no elaboration but is enough to shatter his entire journey. What is most worthy of respect is that he felt no jealousy, no resentment. He chose silent acceptance and continued to give in his roles as a coach, and in returning to his family as an ordinary man. For Americans, in a society that prizes success, victory, and titles, this story is a deeply human reminder. Not every valuable life is measured by the final trophy. In a fiercely competitive culture where many believe winning is everything, Don Mattingly showed that character, loyalty, and integrity endure far longer than any title. The lesson isn't to stop chasing success. It's to understand that a person's worth doesn't vanish just because one victory is missing. And sometimes true greatness lies in still holding on to who you are, even when life doesn't give you the ending you deserve. If Don Mattingly's story makes you think about the real meaning of success and dedication, please hit subscribe so we can keep exploring these untold journeys behind the spotlight together. Thank you for staying until the end of this story, and see you in the next video, where we'll continue listening to the stories that touch the heart and never fade.